Welcome to Historical Legacies. Here, we dive into history's most intriguing stories, unraveling mysteries and uncovering truths from the past. Subscribe to join our journey through time's greatest moments.
Part 1.
Origins on the Frontier. Andrew Jackson's story begins in the rugged frontier of the Waxhaws region, an isolated area that straddled the borders of North and South Carolina. Born on March 15, 1767, Jackson's early life was defined by adversity, loss, and a determination to survive against all odds. His parents, Andrew and Elizabeth Jackson, were Irish immigrants who had come to America in search of a better life. Tragically, his father died in a logging accident just weeks before Andrew's birth, leaving his mother to raise him and his two older brothers in difficult circumstances. The frontier environment was harsh and unforgiving, with frequent conflicts between settlers and Native American tribes, as well as the looming threat of British military action during the Revolutionary War. The Revolutionary War had a profound impact on young Andrew. At the age of 13, he and his brothers joined the Patriot cause. Though still a boy, Jackson served as a courier, carrying messages across enemy lines. This dangerous work exposed him to the realities of war early in life. In 1781, he was captured by British forces and imprisoned. During his captivity, Jackson famously refused to clean the boots of a British officer, resulting in a violent strike that left a scar on his hand and face. This experience not only left physical marks but also deepened his hatred of British authority. While Jackson survived the ordeal, the war exacted a heavy toll on his family. His oldest brother, Hugh, died of heat exhaustion while fighting in the Battle of Stono Ferry. His other brother, Robert, contracted smallpox during their imprisonment and died shortly after their release. Shortly afterward, Jackson's mother succumbed to cholera while volunteering as a nurse for wounded soldiers. By the age of 14, Jackson was an orphan, bereft of close family and forced to navigate life alone. Despite these tragedies, Jackson's indomitable spirit began to shine. He took odd jobs as a schoolteacher and a saddle maker, though he quickly developed a reputation for his fiery temper and aversion to authority. Jackson's rough-and-tumble upbringing instilled in him a fierce independence and a strong sense of personal honor, traits that would define his later career. He eventually studied law in Salisbury, North Carolina, and by 1787, he was admitted to the bar. Jackson's decision to move westward to Tennessee marked the beginning of his rise to prominence. In the frontier town of Nashville, he built a thriving law practice and gained a reputation as a skilled attorney. His sharp legal acumen, combined with his physical bravery and charismatic presence, earned him the respect of his peers and laid the foundation for his future political and military career. Yet, even as he grew in stature, Jackson remained deeply connected to his frontier roots. He cultivated a populist image, portraying himself as a self-made man who embodied the values of perseverance, resilience, and loyalty to the common people. The frontier shaped Jackson in every way. It toughened him physically, forged his fierce determination, and gave him a deep appreciation for the struggles of ordinary Americans. These early experiences set the stage for his transformation into a national hero and ultimately, the 7th President of the United States. In Jackson's mind, his humble beginnings were not a limitation but a source of strength and legitimacy. They were proof that anyone, no matter their origins, could rise to greatness in the land of opportunity.
Part 2.
The Soldier's Path. Andrew Jackson's journey from an orphan teenager to a celebrated military leader is a testament to his resilience and ambition. Following his admission to the bar, Jackson settled in Tennessee, where his sharp legal skills and forceful personality won him respect. However, his true calling lay not in the courtroom but on the battlefield. Tennessee, at the time, was a volatile frontier region fraught with tensions between settlers and Native American tribes. Jackson's rise to prominence was inextricably tied to these conflicts and his role as a defender of the burgeoning settlements. Jackson first served in the Tennessee militia, quickly earning a reputation for his aggressive tactics and uncompromising leadership. His natural ability to inspire loyalty among his troops set him apart. He was not a professional soldier by training, but his willingness to lead from the front and share in the hardships of his men made him a figure of immense respect. One of his early significant military engagements was during the Creek War, a part of the broader conflict of the War of 1812. Jackson's campaign against the Creek Nation was brutal but effective, culminating in the decisive victory at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend in 1814. The victory at Horseshoe Bend not only secured Jackson's reputation as a military leader, but also had far-reaching consequences for Native American communities. The Creek Nation was forced to cede vast territories in the southeast, opening the region for white settlement. Jackson's role in these campaigns demonstrated his strategic acumen and ruthless determination, though his actions also laid the groundwork for his controversial policies toward Native Americans during his presidency. His success in the Creek War earned him a commission as a major general in the United States Army, marking the beginning of his national prominence. Jackson's crowning military achievement came during the War of 1812, specifically at the Battle of New Orleans. In January 1815, Jackson commanded a ragtag force of militia, freed African Americans, Native Americans, and even pirates against a far superior British army. Despite being outnumbered and outgunned, Jackson's clever use of terrain and defensive fortifications led to a resounding American victory. This triumph, though technically after the war's official end due to delayed communication, galvanized national pride and solidified Jackson's status as a hero. The victory at New Orleans had broader implications for the young United States. It demonstrated that the nation could defend its sovereignty against a major European power, boosting American morale and international standing. For Jackson, the battle was a personal vindication and the defining moment of his military career. His ability to unite a diverse force under a single cause and outmaneuver a seasoned enemy showcased his tactical brilliance and unwavering determination. Jackson's military exploits not only earned him accolades, but also deeply influenced his political philosophy. His experiences in battle reinforced his belief in decisive action, loyalty, and the importance of strong leadership. These principles would later shape his approach as president. The military campaigns also forged his image as a champion of the common man, a leader who rose from humble beginnings to achieve greatness through sheer determination. In the eyes of the public, Andrew Jackson was more than a soldier. He was a symbol of American grit and resilience. This legacy of military success would serve as a powerful platform for his entry into national politics, paving the way for his journey to the presidency. Part 3. The Battle of New Orleans and Jackson's Rise to Fame. Andrew Jackson's military career began to take shape after the War of 1812 broke out, a conflict between the United States and Great Britain that had lingering tensions over issues like trade restrictions, impressment of American sailors, and territorial expansion. Jackson, a staunch nationalist, believed the war was a necessary step to secure American sovereignty and to assert the nation's independence from European powers. His rise to fame, however, would be solidified by a singular military event, the Battle of New Orleans. The Battle of New Orleans took place in January 1815, shortly after the Treaty of Ghent had been signed, officially ending the War of 1812, but before the news of the treaty had reached the combatants. British forces, under Major General Edward Pakenham, sought to capture the city of New Orleans, a crucial port in the American South and key to controlling the Mississippi River. Jackson, who had already earned a reputation for his toughness and leadership in the Creek War, was tasked with defending the city. With a diverse force of about 4,000 men, composed of regular soldiers, militia, pirates, freed African Americans, and even local volunteers, Jackson took a position to fortify the area around New Orleans. The British Army, numbering around 8,000, launched a series of attacks on Jackson's entrenched position. Despite being outnumbered and in a less favorable position, Jackson's forces repelled the British with devastating effectiveness. The British lost over 2,000 soldiers, including General Pakenham, while the Americans suffered only about 70 casualties. This overwhelming victory was not only a major blow to British ambitions, but also catapulted Jackson to national fame. He was hailed as a hero across the country, seen as a symbol of American resilience and determination. Jackson's popularity surged, and the victory helped him secure a seat as the representative for Tennessee in Congress and later, his bid for the presidency. The Battle of New Orleans, in many ways, set the stage for Jackson's political career, and it cemented his image as a strong leader capable of leading the nation to victory, even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds. The battle also had broader consequences for the national psyche. It played a significant role in solidifying American nationalism in the wake of the War of 1812, a conflict that many had considered an embarrassing second war for independence against a former colonial power. The victory in New Orleans gave Americans a sense of pride and accomplishment, even though the war itself had been inconclusive in terms of its original aims. It was also instrumental in shaping Jackson's future political philosophy, where his focus on decisive action and unyielding resolve would continue to define his leadership style throughout his presidency. Despite the fact that the Treaty of Ghent had already ended the war, the Battle of New Orleans became a rallying cry for Jackson supporters, emphasizing his leadership in battle and his commitment to defending the United States from foreign aggression. His victory turned Jackson into a household name, and it marked the beginning of his political ascent. The battle's impact on his popularity would be felt in the subsequent decades, helping propel him into the White House and influencing his broader political agenda. Part 4. The Rise to Politics. Andrew Jackson's transition from military hero to political figure was not immediate, but his growing popularity following the War of 1812 made it inevitable. The American public admired his grit, independence, and dedication to the country, seeing in him the qualities of a leader who could represent their interests. By the time he entered politics, Jackson had already cultivated an image as a man of the people, untainted by the elitism often associated with the political establishment. This image, combined with his deep-seated belief in democracy and his frontier values, positioned him as a force to be reckoned with on the national stage. Jackson's first formal entry into politics came when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives from Tennessee in 1796, shortly after the state was admitted to the Union. He served only 1 year in the House before moving to the Senate, where his tenure was similarly brief. While these early political roles were relatively unremarkable, they allowed Jackson to gain experience and establish connections with influential figures. However, he soon grew disillusioned with the political system, frustrated by what he perceived as its inefficiency and detachment from the needs of ordinary citizens. After stepping away from national politics, Jackson focused on his legal career and business ventures in Tennessee. He became a prominent figure in the state, serving as a judge on the Tennessee Supreme Court and building a successful plantation, the Hermitage. His leadership in local politics and his reputation as a war hero made him a natural choice for a more prominent role as national tensions over westward expansion and economic policy began to intensify. By the 1820s, Jackson was ready to re-enter the political arena, this time with the goal of transforming the national government. Jackson's first presidential campaign in 1824 was a turning point in his political career. Running as a candidate of the Democratic-Republican Party, he appealed to voters with his populist message and his record as a military leader. He won the popular vote and secured the most electoral votes, but not the majority required for victory. The election was decided in the House of Representatives, where Speaker Henry Clay's support for John Quincy Adams led to Adams' victory. This outcome, which Jackson's supporters decried as the corrupt bargain, galvanized his base and fueled his determination to win the presidency in 1828. The 1824 election revealed deep divisions within the Democratic-Republican Party and among the American electorate. Jackson's loss highlighted the growing demand for a more inclusive and responsive political system, one that reflected the will of the expanding population. Over the next 4 years, Jackson and his supporters worked to build a political coalition that would eventually become the Democratic Party. They emphasized the need for a government that served the common man and resisted the influence of entrenched elites. By the time the 1828 election arrived, Jackson's message had resonated deeply with a wide swath of the electorate, particularly in the South and West. His victory in that election was not only a personal triumph, but also a turning point in American political history. It marked the rise of Jacksonian democracy, a movement that sought to empower ordinary citizens and challenge the dominance of established political elites. Jackson's political journey, shaped by his frontier upbringing and his military career, had finally brought him to the pinnacle of power.
Part 5.
The birth of Jacksonian democracy. Andrew Jackson's presidency signaled the birth of Jacksonian democracy, a political movement that fundamentally reshaped the American political landscape. It championed the ideals of greater political participation, limited federal government, and a staunch opposition to entrenched elites. For Jackson and his supporters, democracy was not merely a system of governance, but a principle that demanded the inclusion of the common man in the political process. This philosophy resonated powerfully with the expanding electorate, particularly as property ownership requirements for voting were being eliminated in many states. Jacksonian democracy was rooted in the belief that the government should reflect the will of the people rather than the interests of a privileged few. Jackson viewed himself as the embodiment of this ideal, a man who had risen from humble beginnings to serve as the voice of the ordinary citizen. His election in 1828 marked the first time that a presidential candidate had been overwhelmingly supported by voters from outside the traditional political elite. This shift represented a broader democratization of American politics as more citizens began to see themselves as active participants in shaping the nation's future. One of Jackson's early acts as president was to expand the role of the executive branch, asserting that the president was the direct representative of the people. This philosophy was evident in his frequent use of the presidential veto, a tool he employed not just to reject legislation but to challenge policies he believed were not in the public's interest. Jackson's willingness to confront Congress and wield executive power made the presidency a more dynamic and central force in American government. While critics accused him of overreach, his supporters celebrated his bold leadership and his commitment to fighting corruption and elitism. Jackson's vision of democracy also included a focus on states' rights, though he maintained a delicate balance when conflicts arose. He believed that state governments were often better equipped to address local needs than the federal government. However, his approach was not without contradictions. For instance, during the nullification crisis, Jackson took a firm stance against South Carolina's attempt to nullify federal tariffs, asserting the supremacy of the Union. This incident revealed the complexity of Jacksonian democracy, which sought to empower states while preserving the authority of the federal government when necessary to maintain national unity. A cornerstone of Jacksonian democracy was the belief in economic opportunity for all white men. Jackson opposed monopolistic institutions like the Second Bank of the United States, which he viewed as tools of the wealthy elite to control the economy. His successful campaign to dismantle the bank was a defining moment of his presidency, symbolizing his commitment to leveling the economic playing field. Yet, this decision also had unintended consequences, leading to financial instability and contributing to the Panic of 1837. Jacksonian democracy was far from perfect, with significant limitations and contradictions. It excluded women, African Americans, and Native Americans from its vision of political participation, reflecting the deep racial and gender inequalities of the time. Despite these flaws, the movement marked a pivotal moment in American history. It expanded the political power of ordinary citizens, reshaped the presidency, and established new expectations for government accountability. Jackson's leadership during this era solidified his legacy as the people's president, even as his policies and methods sparked fierce debates that continue to shape perceptions of his presidency. The era of Jacksonian democracy remains a defining chapter in the story of American democracy, illustrating both its potential and its challenges. Part 6. The Spoils System and Political Patronage. Andrew Jackson's presidency introduced a controversial practice that became a defining feature of his administration: the spoils system. Rooted in Jackson's belief that government should serve the people rather than entrenched elites, The spoils system involved the rotation of government officials, replacing them with individuals who were loyal to the Democratic Party and supportive of Jackson's vision. Jackson argued that this approach democratized public service, breaking the stranglehold of entrenched bureaucrats and ensuring that fresh perspectives entered the government. Upon assuming office, Jackson wasted no time implementing this policy. He dismissed a significant number of federal employees, replacing them with his political supporters. To Jackson, this was a practical application of his belief that public offices were not permanent entitlements, but should instead reflect the will of the people. His famous assertion that "to the victor belong the spoils" encapsulated his rationale for rewarding loyalty and reinforcing party cohesion. However, this approach drew sharp criticism from his opponents, who accused him of fostering corruption and cronyism. Supporters of the spoils system argued that it was a necessary reform to combat the entrenched elitism of previous administrations. They claimed that Jackson's emphasis on rotation in office encouraged accountability, as officials would serve only as long as they performed their duties well and remained in line with the administration's goals. This view aligned with Jacksonian democracy's broader aim of increasing the influence of ordinary citizens in government. However, the spoils system was not without flaws. Many of the appointees lacked the qualifications or experience necessary for their roles, leading to inefficiencies and mismanagement in some government departments. The critics, particularly from the Whig Party, denounced the spoils system as a threat to the integrity of American governance. They argued that it prioritized loyalty over competence and opened the door to widespread corruption. Indeed, several scandals during Jackson's presidency were linked to the actions of unqualified appointees. Despite these issues, Jackson remained unapologetic, framing the spoils system as a means of empowering the common man and dismantling the grip of Washington insiders. The spoils system also highlighted Jackson's broader approach to politics, which was deeply personal and centered on loyalty. He valued steadfast allegiance to his policies and principles, often rewarding those who demonstrated unwavering support. This emphasis on loyalty extended to his famous kitchen cabinet, an informal group of trusted advisors who played a significant role in shaping his administration. Unlike his formal cabinet, which was occasionally plagued by internal conflicts, the kitchen cabinet provided Jackson with advice that aligned closely with his agenda. The legacy of the spoils system is complex. While it reflected Jackson's commitment to democratizing government, it also exposed the tensions inherent in balancing populist ideals with effective administration. The system's flaws became increasingly apparent in the years following Jackson's presidency, prompting calls for civil service reform in subsequent decades. Yet, during Jackson's time, the spoils system was emblematic of his broader philosophy: a government that served the people, even if it meant upending traditional norms. Jackson's willingness to challenge the status quo and prioritize loyalty over convention remains one of the most debated aspects of his presidency. It illustrates his determination to reshape American politics according to his vision, regardless of the controversies it provoked. Part 7. The Indian Removal Policy. One of the most controversial and enduring aspects of Andrew Jackson's presidency was his policy toward Native Americans, particularly the forced relocation known as the Trail of Tears. Jackson, influenced by a combination of expansionist ideals, racial prejudices, and a desire for economic development, endorsed and implemented policies that led to the forced removal of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States. His belief that Native Americans could not coexist peacefully with white settlers in the expanding frontier was a key factor driving his approach to this issue. Jackson's views on Native Americans were shaped by his frontier upbringing and his experiences as a military leader during conflicts with Native tribes, such as the Creek War. He saw them as obstacles to American progress and believed that relocation to lands west of the Mississippi River was the only viable solution for both settlers and Native peoples. His policy, which culminated in the Indian Removal Act of 1830, justified displacement as a means of providing Native Americans with sovereign lands in the West, free from the encroachment of settlers. The Indian Removal Act gave Jackson the legal authority to negotiate treaties with native tribes, exchanging their ancestral lands in the southeast for territory in what is now Oklahoma. Jackson's administration, with the assistance of state governments and local militias, pressured native tribes to sign these treaties, often through intimidation, coercion, or outright deception. Despite the fact that many tribes were reluctant to leave their land, Jackson's government pushed forward with the removals, arguing that it was a necessary step for the nation's future growth. The Cherokee Nation, in particular, became the focal point of resistance to the removal policy. The Cherokee, having developed a written language, a constitution, and agricultural practices resembling those of their white neighbors, fought the removal in the courts, most notably through the case of Worcester versus Georgia, 1832. In this case, the U.S. Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice John Marshall, ruled that the Cherokee were entitled to remain on their land and that Georgia's laws had no jurisdiction over them. Jackson, famously said to have responded to the ruling with, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it," ignored the court's verdict and proceeded with the removal. Jackson's defiance of the Supreme Court exemplified his broader contempt for what he viewed as an overly powerful judiciary and his belief in the primacy of executive authority. His actions also demonstrated his deep commitment to the principles of Jacksonian democracy, though this time they were at odds with the rights of Native Americans. Jackson's belief in the sovereignty of the U.S. government and its right to expand, even at the expense of indigenous peoples, overshadowed concerns over human rights and legal protections for Native American communities. By the time Jackson left office, the removal process had gained momentum, and thousands of Native Americans had been forcibly relocated to the West. The most infamous chapter of this policy is the Cherokee Nation's forced march in 1838, during the presidency of Martin Van Buren, which became known as the Trail of Tears. Of the approximately 16,000 Cherokee people who began the journey, around 4,000 died from disease, exposure, and starvation. The cruelty and suffering of this journey left an indelible scar on Native American history and has been remembered as a tragic episode of American expansionism. Jackson's Indian removal policy is often regarded as one of the darkest chapters of his presidency and remains a deeply controversial aspect of his legacy. While Jackson's supporters defended the policy as a necessary measure for the expansion of the United States and the protection of settlers, its human cost and violation of Native American rights have sparked outrage and debate for generations. This policy reflected the contradictions inherent in Jacksonian democracy, which championed the rights of the common man while simultaneously excluding entire communities based on race and ethnicity. The Trail of Tears remains a potent symbol of the destructive impact of Jackson's presidency on Native American populations, forever tarnishing his legacy as a champion of democracy.
Part 8.
The Nullification Crisis and States' Rights. Andrew Jackson's presidency was marked by significant tensions between federal authority and states' rights, epitomized by the Nullification Crisis of 1832 to 1833. The crisis centered around South Carolina's challenge to federal tariff laws, with state leaders arguing that states had the right to nullify federal laws they deemed unconstitutional. The conflict put Jackson in a difficult position, as he had long been an advocate for a strong federal government but also sympathized with states' rights, particularly in his home state of Tennessee. However, his commitment to preserving the Union and upholding federal law would ultimately shape his response to the crisis. The roots of the Nullification Crisis lay in the Tariff of 1828, often called the Tariff of Abominations by Southern states. The tariff placed high duties on imported goods, which primarily benefited the northern industrial sector but harmed the southern economy, which relied heavily on imported goods and raw materials. South Carolina, led by John C. Calhoun, the state's vice president and a staunch advocate of states' rights, argued that the tariff was unconstitutional and that individual states had the right to reject or nullify federal laws that they believed overstepped the powers granted to the federal government by the Constitution. Calhoun and other Southern leaders believed that the federal government, in imposing the tariff was violating the principles of limited government and undermining states' sovereignty. They argued that each state had the right to interpret the Constitution for itself, and if a federal law was found to be unconstitutional, the state had the right to refuse to enforce it. This argument was rooted in the concept of nullification, which had been popularized by earlier theorists such as Thomas Jefferson and James Madison during the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions of the late 18th century. Jackson, however, vehemently opposed the idea of nullification, viewing it as a direct threat to the Union and the authority of the federal government. Jackson had a strong commitment to the Union, and he was unwilling to let any state undermine the integrity of the nation. He believed that allowing nullification would set a dangerous precedent, leading to the disintegration of the United States as states could nullify any law they disagreed with. In his 1832 proclamation to the people of South Carolina, Jackson forcefully rejected nullification, calling it incompatible with the existence of the Union and warning that disunion would bring nothing but disaster for South Carolina and the nation. Jackson's response to South Carolina's challenge was swift and decisive. He threatened to send federal troops to South Carolina to enforce the tariff and ordered the preparation of military action if necessary. At the same time, Jackson also sought to avoid an all-out confrontation and pursued a compromise, supporting a reduction in the tariff through the Tariff of 1833, which was negotiated by Henry Clay, a political rival of Jackson's. The compromise reduced the tariff over several years, easing the economic pressure on the South. South Carolina, in turn, backed down, repealing its nullification ordinance and avoiding a direct confrontation with the federal government. The crisis was ultimately resolved peacefully, but it left a lasting impact on Jackson's presidency and American politics. Jackson's handling of the nullification crisis reinforced his belief in the supremacy of federal authority and set a precedent for the federal government's role in resolving intergovernmental disputes. At the same time, it illustrated the complexities of Jacksonian democracy, as Jackson navigated the delicate balance between supporting states' rights and ensuring the unity of the nation. For many, his response cemented his legacy as a strong and decisive leader who would not tolerate threats to the Union, but it also alienated those who believed he was too authoritarian in his approach. The nullification crisis foreshadowed the growing sectional tensions that would ultimately lead to the Civil War decades later. It exposed the deep divisions in American society over the issues of federal power, economic interests, and states' rights. Jackson's actions demonstrated the strength of the presidency in defending national unity, but they also revealed the limitations of his Jacksonian democracy in accommodating the diverse needs and interests of the nation's regions. Part 9. The Bank War. Jackson versus the National Bank. One of the defining battles of Andrew Jackson's presidency was his opposition to the Second Bank of the United States, a powerful institution that he viewed as a symbol of elite privilege and corruption. The Bank War, as it became known, encapsulated Jackson's deep distrust of concentrated economic power and his belief in a government that was more responsive to the common people. This conflict between Jackson and the bank's president, Nicholas Biddle, was not only a political and economic struggle, but also a symbolic confrontation between Jacksonian democracy and the entrenched financial elites of the time. Jackson's opposition to the bank was rooted in his belief that it represented an undue concentration of power in the hands of a small, unelected group of bankers and financiers. He saw the bank as a tool for the rich and powerful to manipulate the economy for their own benefit, often at the expense of ordinary citizens and farmers. Jackson's distrust of centralized banking had been informed by his own experiences with financial institutions, having lost much of his personal fortune during the Panic of 1819 due to the bank's tight monetary policies. He believed that the bank favored the interests of the wealthy elite, granting them access to credit while neglecting the needs of average Americans. Jackson's campaign against the bank gained momentum after he was re-elected in 1832, a victory he considered a mandate from the people to dismantle the institution. In the election, the bank became a central issue, with Jackson's opponent, Henry Clay, supporting its wreck harder, while Jackson called for its destruction. Jackson's victory gave him the political capital to push forward with his plan, despite the strong opposition of pro-bank forces in Congress and the financial sector. He argued that the bank was unconstitutional and that it unduly influenced the economy and politics by using its financial resources to sway elections and influence policy decisions. Jackson's first move in the bank war was to veto the rec charter of the bank in 1832, a decision that shocked many in Washington. The veto was a direct challenge to the established political and economic order and underscored Jackson's commitment to confronting what he saw as an undemocratic institution. Jackson argued that the bank's powers were concentrated in a single institution that answered to neither the people nor the government. He contended that the bank's practices harmed the public and went against the principles of American democracy. After his veto, Jackson took further steps to diminish the bank's influence. He ordered the removal of federal deposits from the bank and redistributed them to various state-chartered banks, often referred to as pet banks. This was a decisive move that significantly weakened the bank's ability to control the nation's currency and finances. Nicholas Biddle, the president of the bank, retaliated by tightening credit, hoping to provoke an economic downturn that would undermine Jackson's popularity. However, Jackson's supporters viewed this as further proof of the bank's corrupt and manipulative nature. The ultimate collapse of the bank came in 1836 when its charter expired, and despite efforts by Jackson's political enemies to renew it, the institution was never rechartered. Jackson's actions during the bank war solidified his reputation as a populist champion of the common man, standing against an institution he believed was exploitative and out of touch with the needs of ordinary Americans. However, the consequences of Jackson's actions were mixed. The removal of the bank led to a period of economic instability, culminating in the Panic of 1837, which resulted in widespread bank failures, unemployment, and a severe recession. Some historians argue that Jackson's dismantling of the bank contributed to this economic crisis, as it created a lack of centralized control over the nation's currency and financial systems. Despite the economic fallout, Jackson's battle with the national bank remains one of the most significant aspects of his presidency. It symbolized his commitment to the principles of Jacksonian democracy, fighting for the common man, challenging the power of financial elites, and decentralizing power from institutions he viewed as undemocratic. Jackson's victory over the bank demonstrated the growing influence of the presidency, particularly in its capacity to challenge established institutions, and it set a precedent for future battles between populist movements and elite-controlled institutions in American history. Part 10. The Legacy of Jacksonian Democracy. Andrew Jackson's presidency was a transformative period in American political history, marking the rise of what became known as Jacksonian democracy. This political movement was grounded in a belief that the government should represent the will of the common people, rather than the interests of elites or the established political class. Jackson's vision was one of greater participation for ordinary citizens in the political process, and his presidency heralded the expansion of suffrage and the end of many traditional political barriers. However, while Jacksonian democracy expanded political participation for some, it also revealed contradictions and limitations that would continue to shape American politics for years to come. One of the most significant aspects of Jacksonian democracy was its emphasis on the power of the presidency and the idea that the president should be a direct representative of the people. Jackson, in contrast to previous presidents, was not a member of the elite political establishment, but a self-made man from humble beginnings. This background shaped his approach to politics, as he sought to empower ordinary citizens and challenge the political aristocracy that had dominated American government since its founding. Jackson's presidency was characterized by his use of the veto, his challenge to the Bank of the United States, and his forceful stance against state nullification, actions that reinforced the power of the executive branch and the notion that the president was the guardian of the nation's democracy. Jacksonian democracy also led to the expansion of suffrage across much of the United States. During Jackson's time, many states loosened property requirements for voting, allowing white men without land to cast ballots. This marked a dramatic shift in American politics, where voting rights had previously been restricted to landowning men. The idea of universal suffrage for white males became a central tenet of Jacksonian thought, and it created a more inclusive political system, at least for white men. Jackson's appeal to this newly enfranchised electorate helped propel him to the presidency, and he positioned himself as a champion of the common man. However, Jacksonian democracy was not inclusive in all respects. While it expanded political participation for white men, it largely excluded African Americans, women, and Native Americans from the democratic process. The expansion of suffrage was restricted to white men, and Jackson's policies toward Native Americans, such as the Indian Removal Act, are often seen as a dark contradiction to his stated ideals of equality and democracy. The removal of the Cherokee, Choctaw, and other tribes from their ancestral lands revealed the limits of Jackson's democratic vision, as these policies prioritized the rights of white settlers over the lives and rights of indigenous peoples. Jackson's populist appeal was also directed at consolidating the power of the federal government while limiting the influence of elites. His opposition to the National Bank was a prime example of this stance, as he sought to dismantle an institution that he believed concentrated too much economic power in the hands of a wealthy few. This anti-elitism also extended to his approach to governance, where he often bypassed traditional institutions and relied on informal networks, such as his kitchen cabinet of close advisors, to shape his policy agenda. While this created a government more responsive to his personal vision, it also raised questions about the centralization of executive power and the erosion of established democratic norms. Jacksonian democracy, therefore, remains a complex legacy. It empowered new groups of voters and expanded the role of the president in American politics, but it also ignored the rights and contributions of significant portions of the population. The democratic ideals Jackson championed were not universally applied, and his presidency reinforced deep racial and gender inequalities that would persist long after his time in office. In this way, Jackson's political vision, while groundbreaking, highlighted the contradictions at the heart of American democracy, where progress for some came at the expense of others. The impact of Jacksonian democracy on the future of American politics was profound, and the debates over its legacy continue to resonate in contemporary discussions of populism, democracy, and national identity. Part 11. Jackson and the Expansion of Slavery. Andrew Jackson's presidency played a pivotal role in the expansion and entrenchment of slavery in the United States, particularly in the southern states. His policies and actions, both personal and political, reflected a deep commitment to preserving and expanding the institution, even as national debates over slavery grew more heated. Jackson, a wealthy landowner with a large plantation, relied on enslaved labor for much of his fortune, and his defense of slavery was rooted in economic self-interest, as well as a broader Southern political ideology that viewed slavery as essential to the region's social order and economic success. At the heart of Jackson's support for slavery was the belief that it was necessary for the prosperity of the Southern economy. Cotton was the backbone of the South's agricultural system, and the labor-intensive cultivation of cotton was only possible through the institution of slavery. Jackson, like many Southern leaders, saw slavery not only as a vital economic institution but also as a cultural and social necessity that maintained order in a society built around plantation life. His own large estate, the Hermitage, was a direct testament to his reliance on enslaved people who worked the land, helped run the household, and contributed to Jackson's growing wealth. Jackson's personal stake in slavery shaped his policy decisions during his time in office. As president, Jackson supported the westward expansion of the United States, a movement that had major implications for the institution of slavery. With the passage of the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the forced relocation of Native American tribes from the southeastern United States, vast swaths of fertile land in states such as Alabama, Mississippi, and Arkansas became available for white settlers. These lands were ideal for cotton cultivation, which in turn increased the demand for enslaved labor. Jackson's policy of Indian removal, which paved the way for further expansion of the plantation system, inadvertently fueled the growth of slavery in the American South. The political and social climate of Jackson's presidency reflected a growing national divide over slavery, with increasing tension between the North, where abolitionist sentiments were rising, and the South, where slavery was not only a way of life, but also a politically entrenched institution. Jackson, a staunch defender of Southern interests, resisted any attempts to limit or abolish slavery, and his policies were aimed at protecting the institution from growing opposition in the North. He argued that the federal government had no right to interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed, and he resisted the influence of abolitionist movements, which were gaining traction in the 1830s. Jackson's support for slavery was also evident in his response to the abolitionist movement and the broader political efforts to address the question of slavery in the territories. In 1836, Congress passed the so-called Gag Rule, which effectively prohibited the discussion of slavery-related petitions and resolutions in the House of Representatives. Jackson, who saw the abolition of slavery as a direct threat to the South's economy and way of life, supported the Gag Rule as a means of silencing anti-slavery voices and preventing the issue from gaining traction in the political discourse. While Jackson's support for slavery ensured its continued dominance in the South, it also contributed to the deepening sectional divide between the North and South, which would eventually lead to the Civil War. Jackson's defense of slavery as an institution was consistent with his view that the federal government should have limited involvement in states' affairs, especially when it came to economic matters that directly benefited the South. His presidency thus not only expanded slavery in newly acquired territories, but also entrenched it as a critical factor in shaping the political landscape of the United States. Jackson's defense of slavery, his policies toward Native Americans, and his support for an economy based on slave labor cast a long shadow over his legacy. While he is often celebrated for expanding political participation for white men, his presidency also perpetuated deep injustices and inequalities for African Americans and Native Americans. The expansion of slavery under Jackson's leadership was a direct cause of the rising tensions between the North and South, tensions that would ultimately result in the Civil War. Part 12. Indian Removal, the Trail of Tears. One of the darkest and most controversial aspects of Andrew Jackson's presidency was his policy of Indian removal, which led to the forced relocation of thousands of Native Americans from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States. Jackson's Indian Removal Act of 1830 authorized the president to negotiate treaties with Native American tribes to exchange their land in the eastern United States for land west of the Mississippi River. Although Jackson portrayed this policy as a way to protect Native Americans from encroaching settlers, its true purpose was to open up land for white settlement and the expansion of slavery. Jackson's belief in the policy of removal was rooted in his view of Native Americans as obstacles to American progress and expansion. He saw their presence as an impediment to the growth of agriculture, particularly cotton farming, and to the settlement of lands that he believed should be cultivated by white Americans. Jackson believed that relocating Native Americans to lands west of the Mississippi River would allow them to live in peace, free from the pressures of white settlers, and create new opportunities for their societies. However, the reality was far harsher, as the policy led to immense suffering and loss of life among Native American communities. The Indian Removal Act was met with resistance from many Native American tribes, most notably the Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, Creek, and Seminole nations. These tribes had established sophisticated societies, complete with written languages, constitutions, and successful agricultural economies, and they fiercely opposed Jackson's policy. In fact, the Cherokee pursued legal challenges to their removal, most famously in the case of Worcester versus Georgia, 1832, where the U.S. Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Cherokees' sovereignty over their lands. Despite this ruling, Jackson refused to enforce the decision, allegedly remarking, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." Jackson's blatant disregard for the court's ruling reflected his determination to carry out his policies, regardless of the law or the rights of Native Americans. The forced relocation of the Native Americans, known as the Trail of Tears, began in the winter of 1838 and continued for several years, involving thousands of Cherokee people and other tribes. The journey was brutal, and over 4,000 Cherokee died from exposure, disease, and malnutrition as they were marched westward under armed guard to the Indian Territory, modern-day Oklahoma. The Trail of Tears became a symbol of the cruelty and inhumanity of Jackson's Indian removal policy, and it stands as one of the most tragic chapters in U.S. history. The Indian removal policy also had lasting effects on the Native American tribes and their cultures. The removal devastated many communities, displacing them from their ancestral homelands and subjecting them to new and unfamiliar territories, where they were often forced into labor and faced harsh conditions. The removal destroyed tribal social structures and forced many Native Americans to adapt to an environment where they struggled to survive, let alone thrive. Jackson's Indian removal policies are a source of significant historical criticism, and his legacy in this regard remains deeply controversial. While he believed he was acting in the best interest of the nation's growth and security, his policies had devastating consequences for the Native American population, leading to the loss of land, life, and cultural heritage. Jackson's disregard for the sovereignty and rights of Native Americans illustrated the limits of his vision of democracy, where Native peoples were treated as obstacles to be eliminated or displaced, rather than citizens with legitimate rights and dignity. The Indian removal policy was emblematic of Jackson's broader approach to governance, which prioritized the interests of white settlers and the expansion of U.S. territory while ignoring or actively undermining the rights of marginalized groups, including Native Americans, African Americans, and women. While Jackson's presidency is often celebrated for its populist appeal and the expansion of political participation for white men, it also set a precedent for the mistreatment and displacement of non-white populations that would continue to shape the nation's history for years to come. Part 13. The Nullification Crisis. State versus Federal Authority. The Nullification Crisis was one of the most significant moments in Jackson's presidency, as it marked a direct challenge to the authority of the federal government and posed a threat to national unity. The crisis centered on South Carolina's opposition to the federal tariff laws, particularly the Tariff of 1828, which the state's leaders believed unfairly favored northern industries at the expense of the southern economy. South Carolina, which relied heavily on the importation of goods and cotton exports, saw the tariffs as an economic burden that hurt its interests. John Seeds Calhoun, Jackson's vice president at the time, emerged as one of the primary intellectual forces behind the nullification doctrine. Calhoun argued that states had the constitutional right to nullify any federal law they deemed unjust or harmful to their interests. This idea was based on his interpretation of the compact theory of government, which suggested that the states had voluntarily joined the Union and therefore retained certain powers to challenge federal authority. South Carolina took Calhoun's theory to its logical conclusion, declaring that the Tariff of 1828, along with the Tariff of 1832, were unconstitutional and would not be enforced within the state. In response, Jackson, who viewed the nullification of federal laws as a direct threat to the Union, took a firm stance against South Carolina's actions. Jackson's personal attachment to the Union, shaped by his military career and his vision of a strong, indivisible nation, made him adamant that no state could defy the federal government without severe consequences. Jackson's response included the issuance of his famous Nullification Proclamation in December 1832, in which he rejected the idea that states could nullify federal laws. In the proclamation, he stated that the Union must be preserved, asserting that the Constitution granted the federal government the authority to levy taxes and enforce laws throughout the entire nation. Jackson also pushed Congress to pass the Force Bill, which authorized the president to use military force against any state that resisted federal law enforcement. The standoff led to a tense political crisis, with many fearing that South Carolina might secede from the Union entirely, a move that could have led to the disintegration of the country. Jackson made it clear that he would not tolerate secession, but at the same time, he sought to avoid armed conflict by negotiating a compromise. Henry Clay, a senator from Kentucky, played a crucial role in crafting the compromise tariff of 1833, which gradually reduced the rates of the tariffs that South Carolina had objected to. South Carolina, having successfully achieved a reduction in the tariffs, backed down from its nullification stance, and the crisis was resolved without bloodshed. The resolution of the nullification crisis reinforced Jackson's authority as president and was a victory for the concept of national supremacy over state rights. Jackson's firm leadership during this time showcased his dedication to preserving the Union and maintaining the power of the federal government, but it also exposed the deep divisions in the country over issues of states' rights and the balance of power between state and federal authorities. The crisis would have lasting implications for the development of American political thought, particularly in how the issue of federalism would evolve leading up to the Civil War. Part 14. The Bank War. Jackson versus the National Bank. Andrew Jackson's confrontation with the Second Bank of the United States, known as the Bank War, was one of the most contentious battles of his presidency, one that had far-reaching consequences for the nation's financial system. Jackson's opposition to the bank was rooted in his belief that it was an undemocratic institution that concentrated financial power in the hands of a wealthy elite, undermining the economic interests of the common people. Jackson saw the bank as a tool for economic manipulation and a corrupt monopoly that favored the rich, particularly its president, Nicholas Biddle, and its support from influential political figures. The bank, established in 1816, served as the nation's central financial institution, regulating credit, holding government deposits, and lending money to both the government and private citizens. Its influence was vast, and Jackson saw it as an embodiment of the concentration of power that threatened to undermine the democratic principles of the American Republic. The bank's financial control made it an entity Jackson viewed as dangerous to the people, particularly the farmers and laborers who he believed were the backbone of the nation's economy. In 1832, the bank's charter came up for renewal, and Jackson, who had long opposed its existence, made it clear that he would veto the bill to rec-harder it. Jackson's veto of the rec-harder was not just a rejection of the bank itself, but a declaration of his commitment to challenging the dominance of the elites and protecting the interests of the common people. His veto message was a direct attack on the bank's monopoly power and the undue influence it had over the nation's economic system. He argued that the bank was unconstitutional, although the Supreme Court had ruled in McCulloch v. Maryland, 1819, that it was a legitimate institution under the Constitution. Jackson's veto energized his supporters and intensified the political battle over the bank. Following the veto, Jackson took further steps to dismantle the bank's influence, including ordering the removal of federal deposits from the bank and placing them in state-chartered banks, referred to as pet banks. This decision was controversial, as it led to economic instability, including wild speculation and a boom in land sales, which would contribute to the Panic of 1837. Jackson's opponents, including former President Henry Clay and financial elites, attacked him for his heavy-handed actions, accusing him of undermining the national economy and destabilizing the banking system. Despite the financial turmoil that followed, Jackson's victory over the bank reshaped the American banking system and left a legacy of distrust towards centralized financial institutions. His success in defeating the bank was hailed by his supporters as a triumph for the people, but it also sowed the seeds for financial instability that would affect the nation for decades to come. The Bank War ultimately marked a key moment in Jacksonian democracy, demonstrating Jackson's deep commitment to limiting the power of centralized institutions and asserting the rights of ordinary citizens over the interests of elites. Part 15. Legacy of Andrew Jackson. A controversial figure in American history, Andrew Jackson's legacy is one of the most polarizing in American history, with his presidency leaving an indelible mark on the nation's political, social, and economic landscape. Jackson's rise to power and his populist appeal revolutionized American politics, making him a hero to many and a villain to others. He is often credited with making the presidency the central force in American politics, strengthening the office and transforming the relationship between the executive branch and the people. However, his policies, especially those relating to Native American removal, slavery, and the economy, have drawn significant criticism, and they continue to be a source of debate among historians and political scholars. Jackson's populism and his identification with the common man set him apart from previous presidents. He expanded suffrage to include more white men, making the electorate more inclusive and laying the foundation for a more democratic political system in the U.S. His embrace of the idea that the people, rather than elites, should rule the country resonated deeply with voters, and his direct style of leadership and boldness in confronting national issues solidified his place in history as a transformative figure. Jackson was also an advocate for states' rights, particularly when it came to issues like the Bank War, where he sought to dismantle what he saw as an overbearing national institution. However, Jackson's legacy is deeply marred by his treatment of Native Americans. The forced removal of the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Creek, and Seminole nations from their ancestral lands in the southeastern United States, known as the Trail of Tears, resulted in the deaths of thousands and remains one of the darkest chapters in American history. His policies, which stripped Native Americans of their land and their rights, are widely condemned today as a tragic and genocidal part of Jackson's presidency. Jackson's legacy is also tainted by his unwavering support for slavery. He was a slave owner himself and fought to protect the institution of slavery in the southern states, opposing efforts to limit its spread into new territories and states. Jackson's views on slavery were deeply entrenched in the political and economic realities of his time, but his policies helped solidify the system for decades, ultimately contributing to the tensions that led to the Civil War. While Jackson is celebrated for his military victories and his role in shaping American democracy, his presidency remains controversial due to the harmful impact of his policies on marginalized groups. His legacy, marked by both populist success and moral failure, continues to provoke strong reactions, with some seeing him as a champion of the common man and others as a symbol of the nation's deeply entrenched inequalities. Thanks for tuning in to Historical Legacies. If you enjoyed this dive into history, please like, subscribe, and share. Join us next time for more fascinating stories from the past.